Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the 1867 Sports Show. We are on number Andre Dury tonight. And the reason why I mentioned Andre Dury is because not only did he give me nightmares as an opponent of mine in my youthful days of playing football, but we're talking CFL tonight, not only with my co-host Kyle Skinner, but we've got the great Dave Naylor, CFL Hall of Fame journalist, with us tonight. Dave, welcome to the 1867 Sports Show.
Hey, glad to join you guys. And I'm a big fan of Andre Dury as well. So there you go.
Yeah, Andre was he was like the Barry Sanders of Canada, and not a lot of people know that because of the horrific injury that he had at the tail end of his university career, but still carved out a pretty good CFL run in his own right. So yeah, I had the misfortune of watching him across the field many a time, and when we had to travel down to York, but yeah, like I said, phenomenal player. Happy that he was able to do what he did. But anyways, how are we doing, Dave?
Good. It's been a busy stretch, man. I like last week was unreal. Like I think we had, the announcement, the formal announcement of a new owner for the Edmonton team, and Nathan Rourke's re-signing within about 45 minutes of each other. We've had, the Chad Kelly news coming. We've had the new defensive coordinator in Hamilton. Yeah, it was furious last week, and so and really, it would be hard for me to think of a series of days or part of a week where just so much CFL news just seemed to be breaking, moment after moment after moment. So yeah, that's good because that keeps me employed, and it's been an interesting season. I mean, here we are at the midway, and other than Montreal being 9-1, it's like everybody else is bunched up there. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen the West Division look like it does right now at this point of the year. And other than Hamilton, we've got kind of one team that's way out in front and one that's trailing. And I think we got 7 teams you can almost throw into the mix between.
Yeah. Well, we were joking off air there. Like, I think they were just waiting all these headlines to break because they knew you were coming on the show.
We booked this we didn't book this like yesterday. We booked this like 3 weeks ago. You guys have a crystal ball or something? Yeah.
If we did, our gambling records would be a whole lot better. That's for sure. But I mean, we might as well start right off the top there, right? Like, the Canada's chosen golden boy returning north of the border after a few cups of coffee with obviously the Giants and the Falcons and Patriots and whatnot. Nathan Rourke coming back to Canada, joining the BC Lions. And I mean, bit of an uneven performance in his first taste of CFL action, but what is your take on what's a realistic expectation for BC fans for what Rourke can bring to the table? Because I think there's a few of them out there who think, the savior has returned. You might as well get the Grey Cup ready for us at this point. But, I think maybe week 1 was a bit of a telling factor that it might not just be that simple to walk on the field and produce.
No, and look, I'll tell you one thing. I've studied Nathan Rourke's history a little bit, okay? And one of the things that you can see if you follow his history is he has been a quick study everywhere he's been. There has not been like elongated learning curves at any stop in the way, okay? Real quick, I'll run through it. He wins a high school championship as a junior in Oakville, Ontario. He transfers for his senior year to a school in Alabama. They go 13-0. Then he goes to a junior college in Kansas because he kind of missed the recruiting cycle in the U.S. high schools. He's a conference all-star in his one and only year there. Then he goes to Ohio, and I think he became the starter in 3 games and took them to 3 consecutive bowl games, a program that had been to not a whole lot of bowl games in, the previous 130 years or so. Then he goes to the Canadian Football League. And look, I was as skeptical as anybody about Nathan being the starter in year number 2, and nothing to do with him being Canadian, by the way. It all had to do with, I've watched this league for a long time, and not many guys with 2 starts in year 2 are ready to be full-time starters, and he put up an historic season. I was at 2 of his preseason games in the National Football League last year. I thought he played very well. If you look at his numbers, I think he was 23 of 35 for 348 yards, a touchdown, no interceptions. If you take away the drives that ended in kneel downs and a 1-play drive where there was a fumble by a running back, it was 9 drives and 5 touchdowns. He's been very, very effective almost immediately, every level he's been. So I think the curve is going to be pretty short. That said, if you look at what he had been through, I mean, it's literally 4 playbooks in 4 months and 3 of them in another league. and I think also just the emotion of, giving up on the National Football League dream for now, landing back in BC, 35,000 people, different times. I mean, how many things did the guy have thrown at him? So I think he'll be a lot better in Ottawa, and I expect I think you're going to see pretty significant improvement week after week after week. And I think we were all guilty of maybe expecting a little too much. I was on the panel that night. In pregame, I said I expected him, to play well. I think it was very, very hard to get the image of Nathan Rourke from 2022 out of your head, because all we've ever seen him do is be great. It was almost surreal, at the end of the second quarter, like, wow. It was just hard to imagine him struggling that much. But, with retrospect, it was understandable, and I expect he'll be much better.
I 100% concur with everything you're saying, because, I'm a big proponent on, getting yourself accustomed to a system that you're going to be in. You hit the nail on the head when you said he's literally gone through, not even taking into account this year. Look at how many teams he's had to go in and learn their playbooks on the last 3 years, right? Yeah. Coming up to the CFL, then going to the NFL, bouncing around to 4 teams, and then coming back to the CFL. It's not as easy to do. And, for anyone who hasn't played football, try and study a playbook and see how much you can retain in 6 months, let alone, a couple of weeks.
Well, and the last time we saw somebody parachuted in like that, now this guy had no CFL experience, was Johnny Manziel in Montreal. Yeah. He threw 4 picks in the first half, right? And and somebody pointed out this to me, got a conversation on Twitter the other day, who said, which kind of makes all the more amazing what Zach Collaros did in 2019. Because I remember when they made that trade, and I was like, look, this ain't like adding a center fielder to the top of your lineup. Like, this is a quarterback.
Yeah.
And was as quick a study as anybody he hadn't played, right? He since week 1. And of course they won the Grey Cup and has never looked back. But so it can be done. It has been done, but man, it ain't easy. That's to your point.
Yeah. And I think, with the talent that Nathan has, he's definitely setting himself up for long-term success. And I think that Rick Campbell and the group there kind of know that. I think they probably, if you would have asked them, they would have expected him to come out and be a little rusty, but hey, get the rust off in this game so that for the stretch run that we've got, ahead of us, because like you were saying, there's a mishmash of teams kind of right in the middle there battling for position. Let's get him to the top of his game when it matters in the playoffs.
How do you knock it off? You got to play.
Yeah.
You got to play reps, live reps. You can practice all you want, but that's part of how you get him to where you want him to be. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, like I'm taking a look at, back in the day when I was recruited by the University of Ohio, they were a bottom feeder for years and years and years. They were not relevant until Nathan Rourke was under center. And then obviously passing the baton on to his brother, who's since taken it to another level as well. But the fact that he's been able to be so successful across the entirety of his football career, I wouldn't be surprised if we're talking about BC making a surprise run down the stretch here and being a true Grey Cup contender with him at the helm.
Let me ask you guys, have you ever seen a post-game news conference like the one that he gave the other night? I watched it both in demeanor and words. I don't know if I've ever seen anything like that, like a public apology. And you got to know Nathan a little bit, right? He's not an attention-seeking guy. He's not in it for the money or the glory. He just loves the game, And I think he felt like he let down the game, and and by sort of by nature the fans, because it's impossible to ignore all the attention that was going on around him. So, like I said, when you watch that news conference, that was not a performance. That was his soul talking, and furthermore, I think he'll be better.
Yeah, and nothing.
Sorry, I was saying nothing welcomes you back into Canada than giving the Canadian response at the very end of a game saying you're sorry.
Yeah,
no kidding.
Yeah, and I think it is to a degree refreshing, right, to see a quarterback go up there and just kind of fall on his sword like that. Say, hey, this one's on me. I take full responsibility, everything, because with the modern athlete being such a brand now, right? It would have been very easy for him to go up there and be like, guys, got parachuted in here last week. What did you expect of me, right? So it was pretty, I guess, a window into his real personality as far as this is what this guy is like, but behind closed doors, and he kind of bared it all in front of everyone there.
He's very he does not really, even when you talk to him, he doesn't really have an athlete's persona. When I've talked to him off the record, standing there in uniform, he really does have kind of just he's just like a regular human being. He doesn't. Some guys project, that they are an athlete or a quarterback, and Nathan really doesn't really envelop that persona. And I think I think it speaks to his authenticity. And I'll just tell you guys like a little story that when I was in Dallas last year when he threw that insane pass where he, broke 4 tackles and hit the guy in stride in the end zone, and Patrick Mahomes was tweeting about it, and Adam Schefter was tweeting about it, and Warren Sapp was tweeting about it. And because Trevor Lawrence had played the first 2 series, I think all the Jacksonville reporters were out at his podium. And I walked in the locker room, and there's literally nobody at Nathan Rourke's locker. And I walk up to him, and it literally, our conversation kind of went like this. It was like, man, that was a heck of a pass. And he just went, it's football. like that. That's football. He just sent 100,000 people at Jerry's house buzzing. What do you mean? It's just that's, like I said, he does not really buy into the athlete persona.
Yeah. And again, I think that's what really sets him up for long-term success, is because he never gets too high, never gets too low, which is what you want out of your quarterback. Now, you mentioned obviously Nathan Rourke, and he's going to be coming into Ottawa this coming weekend to, obviously take on the Red Blacks and whatnot. You've had a very long career. You've had the distinction of covering multiple iterations of the Ottawa CFL journey as we've kind of experienced it over the course of the last 4 decades, let's say. Looking back at the Rough Riders, the Renegades, and now the Red Blacks, maybe give us, a couple of stories from back then in the Rough Riders and Renegades times that really kind of stuck out as one. I knew that this wasn't going to work long term and they were going to fold. And then, maybe, another one where, hey, we're back. This is a new brand. I thought this was going to work. And here we are today.
Boy, I'll tell you. Yeah, I got a million Ottawa football stories. My goodness. Yeah. It's, Ottawa football is, I'm not a fan of every team, but Ottawa football is in my soul a little bit. As I say, I buried the Rough Riders as a journalist. I buried the Renegades as a journalist. I covered City Hall when they were going to demolish the stadium and replace it with condos. Heck, I was the play-by-play broadcaster for the Ottawa Bootleggers, the semi-pro same stadium in like 1989, 90, So Ottawa football and I go way back. And I'll tell you, a few moments that in 2004, when the Grey Cup was there and the Renegades were in what turned out to be their second last season, Don Brennan of the Ottawa Sun, was a friend and a guy, wrote a column saying the Gleibermans are coming back to Ottawa and they're going to own the team, with this group and take it over. And it was such a preposterous story that I mean, even though I like Don and I thought there's no way this is happening. There's just no way, and again, Don Brennan's a credible writer. I like him. I just thought there's just no way that happened. And I called Brad Waters, who was the owner of the team at that time, and said, Brad, have you seen this Don Brennan column about the Gleibermans coming back in to own the Renegades? And Brad said back to me, well, Dave, somebody's got to fund this team. And my just dropped. I mean, I was like, it was just, it was like, it's like seeing something come back from the dead, right? Because the Gleibermans were just infamous from their first time, right? And I should say, I like Lonnie Gleiberman a lot. I had a conversation with him last fall, actually, about some things. And as a person, I really like him. I thought he had terrible instincts as an operator of a football team.
It's putting it lightly.
Yeah, it regularly betrayed him. I mean, the John Jenkins news conference, again, John Jenkins never got to coach that team. But when he showed up in that suit, if you guys ever can find the photo of John Jenkins in a suit with a tail down to his knees, red and black and the flowing hair, and talking about, throwing the football 90% of the time. And we all just thought, oh my goodness. And that one never happened. The Rough Riders, it was funny. The Rough Riders were, God, how many different, lives did I live covering that team? The funny thing I remember is the CFL was accused sort of not being current or not being with a younger generation around that time in the 90s. And I still remember the last ever Ottawa Rough Rider game was against the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. And I remember Kevin McDougall played quarterback for Winnipeg, was a former Notre Dame guy. And the halftime show in that game was the Shriners, who, and I know they do a lot of great work in the community and things like that, but their average age is like up there.
75.
At least, right? And I remember these guys did this march at halftime, and it was like, dum, 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 dum. And I thought, boy, if you were planning a halftime show for a team that you thought was about to fold, this would be it.
Yeah. The guards from Wizard of Oz there came into that theme song, I'm pretty sure.
A reporter came to me and said to me, he said, we should start the junior Shriners, and the first thing on the agenda for the first meeting is parades.
Did they at least have the little cars come out there that they do in the parades, or they left those at the shop?
Can't remember. And look, I can remember when Joanne Polak, of course, who was the first female general manager in professional sports, which was you think how long ago that happened, and she was when I look at what her age was then, like I think she was about 30, which is, again, young for a general manager, and the first female general manager. And I remember there was a night in Ottawa where a fan ran onto the field and climbed the goalpost and refused to come down. Okay. And she walked out onto the field with her purse on her arm and stood there at the bottom of the goalpost and yelled at this guy to come down. I mean, there are so many scenes, from that team. My goodness. And, it's funny. I'll tell you a positive one. I was in Chicago last Thursday, and I got to meet with Kerry Joseph, who was the quarterback coach of the Chicago Bears. And of course, has Caleb Williams as his pupil. And I were talking about Kerry, and I said, Kerry, I remember the first story that was written in the offseason that the Renegades had signed this guy, Kerry Joseph, who played safety in the NFL and running back a little bit with the Bengals before he went to Seattle and was a college quarterback. He was actually the runner-up for the Walter Payton Award to Dave Dickinson in, I think, 1995. Anyway, but I remember looking at the story, and I told him, I said, I looked at that story and I said, there's a guy who'll be gone in 4 days. That's a nice story. It's interesting. You bring him into camp. Okay, this was nice. Gone, right? And I remember I showed up to camp on about day 3. They were out at Kempville or Stittsville. I think it was Kempville they were. And I remember I showed up to camp, and I remember just saying, so what, what's the buzz at camp? It's kind of what you ask when you show up at day 3. You ask other people, the media, other coaches or scouts around, and everybody just looked at me and said, Kerry Joseph. And it was it took 72 hours for him to be the guy. He went from sort of long shot, why don't we try this guy? And I was telling him that story the other day, and I remember his first game, that was a very positive story, the way Kerry came in and just kind of put that franchise on a different level. I mean, they never made the playoffs, despite at least one year they had a 3-0 start. You'd have a short list of teams that have started 3-0 and missed the CFL playoffs, but they managed to. Yeah. But I'll tell you, last one, because you guys, there was a point in the end of the Renegades, okay, where it was the football staff and the administration staff were in a civil war on opposite sides of the stadium. You went over to the football staff and they were talking bleep about the administration staff.
Yep.
And the administration staff was talking bleep about the football staff. You're yeah, I don't think this isn't good. It's probably a blessing they didn't play that year. That was 2006 when it all went down. And the last Ottawa story, when the Red Blacks came back, I was hosting radio in Toronto, and we were going to go do a radio show from Ottawa. It was the Argos playing at Ottawa. We were going to go do our broadcast from the game, first ever Ottawa Red Blacks game. And there was some issue with like us tends to be, that some of the technology was still being tested out and they weren't sure it was going to work. And my boss came and said, look, we're not going to spend all this money to go down and do that and find that when they hit play, it's not transmitting. We're not going to go. So I ended up staying and I watched the game by myself on my couch. And I believe the game ended with Toronto driving at the end and Ottawa had an interception with 20 seconds left and the place went nuts. And I cried. by myself on my couch, and not cried because I'm a Red Blacks fan or an Ottawa football fan, but just all the meetings that I had covered, all the talk of the demolishment of the stadium, all the Ottawa horror stories of football, sitting there on my couch and watching something that I thought might never happen again. I mean, I really thought when the Renegades went down, that might be it. And so to see them playing again that night was really special for me. So I'll end my Ottawa football stories on a happy note.
Yeah. And I mean, you're talking about crying. You got me a little misty-eyed talking about Kerry Joseph. And I just remember him costing me my only chance at a Grey Cup ring when he went Joe Montana on us in 2007 with Saskatchewan and knocked my BC team out of the playoffs. But anyways, thanks for bringing up Kerry Joseph. Nice little sore spot for me. Kyle loves it whenever I have a little, thorn in my side. So that's good.
Still hurt. They never stop hurting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we kind of went through both a house of horrors of ownership there, and obviously now turning the page into the new era of the Red Blacks and the good position that they find themselves in the East. But obviously some ownership news happening out West as well, with Edmonton getting a new owner in there, and that kind of drawn out saga now seems to have a very positive resolution there. So what are kind of the knee-jerk reactions in terms of the new ownership group? And we already covered how Chris Jones several episodes ago was relieved of duties, and it's kind of a new era out there in terms of front office and along the sidelines. Do you get much sense as far as, is this going to be the classic, hey, new owner, they're going to clean house and it's bringing in their guys? Or do you think they might give kind of the people in place right now a bit of a longer leash and they can maybe earn their way back to still being there in 2025?
Well, I mean, they're 3-0 in their last three, right? And there's half a
pretty
season
good start.
Look, if everything I understand about this owner, is that he's going to hire a team president, and the team president, will make evaluations based on what we've seen there. And, look, they have played well. And I don't think, everybody there is dead man walking, depending on, what happens the rest of this season. It's funny because I don't know a whole lot about this owner, but I love the fact that he's a former season ticket holder. Mm-hmm. I think when former customers become owners of businesses and sports franchises specifically, I think usually that leads to good things. And especially in this case, because he obviously sat there week after week after week and watched this thing decline and would have a pretty good idea about, how to bring it back. It was fairly quiet in terms of the pushback of that team, going from public to private. I thought there might be more of the kind of knee jerk about no, we can't have that happen, but because 75 years of community ownership and now you go private. It's funny though, he didn't pay for, there's no fee for that franchise because it was a nonprofit board that owned it. But I think the idea is that every dollar you extract from him, even if you could have got a franchise fee out of him, wouldn't you rather see him put it into the team? I think that's the franchise, right? That it's going to take millions of dollars to invest, get it back to once it was. There's obviously potentially a stadium play. He's already in conversation with government about that, whether that's a retrofit of Commonwealth or an all-new stadium. But the other thing about this guy, from what I understand, is he's fabulously wealthy, which brings him in lockstep with the other private owners in the CFL. This is one of the biggest differences of the CFL between now and like 30, 40 years ago, right? And I'm actually going to do something on this sometime because I think it would be worth sort of pointing out that people think of this as kind of the penniless league, right? The CFL, cash flow low, all that kind of stuff. And historically, I mean, there were owners in this league of relatively marginal wealth to the extent that, if their team went 2-5 and they had a couple of rain dates at home, like, we may need a bailout by Labor Day, right?
Yeah.
Go through the owners now. Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, Calgary Sports, Amar Dolman, Bob Young, Pierre Carl Pelado. I mean, like there's no issue. It's a great, honestly, it's fabulous insurance for the Canadian Football League, just in terms of the finances of the people around the Board of Governors table. The other thing about it is, how do wealthy people get wealthy? They're really, really smart and good business people. So, the fact that you have 7 owners around the table that have that kind of background in business and have those kinds of resources, And then you pair that with the public ownership teams in Saskatchewan and Winnipeg, which are among the highest grossing teams. It's a board of governors, the likes of which this league has never enjoyed. So that's a really good thing for the league's overall security.
Yeah, and speaking of ownership, obviously you just mentioned we've got a lot of different owners that we had now as opposed to where it was in the 90s and early 2000s when it was kind of on life support. But we still have that nagging 10th team that everyone keeps talking about that could really diversify the league even more than it is now and really set it up for long-term growth and sustainability. Have you heard anything that's kind of being brought back? I know Randy Ambrosie's talked about having a team out east, but have they looked at a place like Quebec City maybe to revisit putting a stadium there with Laval University or anything of that ilk that can really kind of bring that 10th team into the CFL?
On Quebec City, I have not asked recently. I probably asked 6 months ago, and I think it's in discussion stage, and by discussion I mean internal discussion, not with parties in Quebec City.
Mm-hmm.
It is kind of where they turn their attention. Look, I think the league felt, I don't want to say burned, but let down by Halifax.
Right.
I felt like, hey, we went out there every year and spent money and put on a party and engaged with the community, and nothing. And there was a group, of course, that popped up before COVID and things, and I don't want to speak ill of that group, but they weren't rooted in Halifax. Some people had connections to Halifax, but that's what's always been missing, right? You can't do this from the outside, especially in Atlantic Canada, right? Because I think sometimes there's a bit of a, people, you're always more trusting of a business venture like this if it comes from within your community as opposed to if it comes from outsiders. And that's what's been missing. They need somebody local to stand up and say, I want to do this. And I think if you had that person or that group, you would get some traction, but it can't be outsiders. Same thing with Quebec City. I mean, unilingual francophone city, it better be internal, that somebody's coming up to do that. That's what you need. You need local champions. What did you have in Ottawa? You had 5 local champions, right? 5 guys who stood up and said, this is what we want to do. And I think it took them 7 years from the first time they met till kickoff. And they already had, a stadium. They just had to retrofit it. It wasn't like they were starting from scratch, but that's the issue, right? And when you talk about 10th team, I mean, stadium. The financing of outdoor stadiums in Canada is really, really difficult. And if you don't have a Commonwealth Games or a Pan Am Games or something that you can use to kind of leverage the economics of that, it's really, really hard. And in fact, the CFL is not a huge money league and not a huge business surefire success. There's skepticism about, well, what if we build this and it doesn't work? Because the margins in the CFL are pretty small. So right. I don't feel like, I know the league keeps talking about expansion. I know their consultants tell them you need to get to 10 teams because you can basically create 25% more content every week. Mm-hmm. One team gives you 25% more content. You have 5 games a week instead of 4. You can get rid of 3 bye weeks. You can shorten your season. You can start it at the same time, move the Grey Cup up 2 weeks, and only have 1 bye week. There's so many positive things you can get to a 10th team. I'll tell you, that somebody floated this idea at me, and I've seen it, other people kick it around too, so I'll just mention it. If the UFL were to fold, I would go after St. Louis. Okay. I would go to St. Louis and say, you'll be our 10th team. And yeah, of course, you get into issues with the ratio and all that. And I'm old enough to have lived through the first best expansion era. Okay. Couple things were different in those days. The requirement was 10 starting Canadians. Now it's 7. Okay. And the quality of Canadian players in the league right now is so much higher than it was 30 years ago. I mean, you only need look at the National Football League. There were 37 Canadians on NFL rosters when in the second week of July, right before training camp. There's 34 now. Look at how many there were in 1994, 1995. Like maybe 10. You know what I mean? So I'm just saying that's just a way to sort of get a barometer on the level of Canadian football talent. Because obviously, if you're putting 3.5 times as many players in the National Football League, your whole body of Canadian talent is rising up. So I don't have any real doubts that a team having to dress and start 7 Canadians could compete against an All-American roster in today's, again, especially with the familiarity of the game and all that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, if the UFL were to fold, I was Randy Ambrosie, I would absolutely go after St. Louis and, take their 35,000 that show every week to watch football. I mean,
yeah,
it's not like they know the teams that they're playing now. So if they've got to cheer on Saskatchewan or Winnipeg, or, I would probably be, more appealing, I would think, than, the Birmingham Stallions or whoever.
So, in that thought, how close was the CFL to partnering with the XFL before they merged with the USFL? Because I know that there were talks, but
I think it was quite close. Or I wouldn't say close. I'll say I can't tell you how close it was, but I can tell you there was a lot of momentum behind it at a certain point. Yeah, and you got to remember the CFL hadn't played in a year, right? You had no owner in BC. Like David Braley's estate owned the team. You had a lot of unhappy owners in the league, and you had a couple of teams that really wanted to do it. Toronto being one of them. So I think there was a lot of momentum behind that around the time that it was announced. Like when they put out that release and said, that was happening. I mean, honest to goodness, guys, I'll tell you that the story is that, I got a phone call like 7:30 that morning. Like basically, what are you doing in half an hour? What do you mean? It's like 7:30.
Sleeping.
We're going to put you on a call with, I think it was Randy Ambrosi. I think Randy was on it. The CEO of the XFL and I think it was the commissioner of the XFL and the CEO. And the CEO is the woman, Danny Garcia, who married to Dwayne Johnson. She was on that call. It was her and I think their commissioner or one of their high execs, if it wasn't the commissioner, and I believe anyway, but it was like I was barely awake, right? And of course I didn't have a sniff of this thing, like nothing. And so, I go to bed, it's a regular night. The next morning at 8 a.m, I'm on a call with Danny Garcia and all that. And so, I mean, again, I don't think they would have done that with me if there wasn't a lot of momentum behind that. And ultimately, I think where it fell apart was, I think, over control. Who's going to control this league? Who's going to control the finances? Ultimately, the Canadian Football League. And look, in retrospect, I've taken a lot of criticism for being behind that idea. I like to clarify what I said. I said the league owes itself to explore this. I don't know if it's the right thing to do. I'm not in the meetings. I can't tell you it's the right thing to do, but I absolutely thought they should explore it. What a lot of people said is don't even look at it. Okay. I wasn't that guy. I was the guy who said, yes, you need to look at it because we haven't played football in a year and we don't know how many owners we have. And, stuff changes. Right. And it ultimately, I think the league made the right decision, and whether, I think it would have required a lot of compromise and a lot of giving up of control. And ultimately, I think it's good, but I do think that, one of the constraints of the league, I always say this, there's certain facts or things in history you can use to try to put it in perspective. Okay. When I was born, okay, the Canadian Football League was 50% bigger than the National Hockey League. There were 6 NHL teams and 9 CFL teams. So it's time for growth. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and you're not going to get any pushback from Kyle and I because we're very much in the same page of they needed to explore that as much as they could to see where this game could be. I played in the league. I know where it could be as opposed to where it is. Right. And losing that season was so detrimental to the next 20 years, right? So doing something drastic, they had to look at it. So 100%. I remember, seeing when you were posting about that, saying this is something they need to explore. I was fist pumping in the background saying, finally, someone is actually saying what they need to do, because too many people, like Kyle and I have talked about many a time, they're very old school. Don't touch it. We're sustainable. We've seen leagues come and go. Yes, but we also haven't seen a pandemic wipe out an entire season and potentially an entire ownership group, right? So, absolutely. 100%.
Randy Ambrosi will tell you that there were things they got done internally that they wouldn't have been able to get done if it hadn't been for the XFL partnership proposition. Guys, if we're not going to do this, then we got things like the revenue sharing piece, for instance, right? Yeah. I think it forced them to make changes that they might not have made without that alternative on their doorstep.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I think that everything that's kind of resulted from that has been positive, whether they went forward with it or not. And, it's something that Kyle and I, again, have talked about in a previous episode. Something simple. Both leagues play independently. Champions of each league, home series. One plays in Canada with CFL rules. One plays in the US with USFL rules or UFL rules. I think that would draw some ratings.
Line up, right? Because they're done in June and we're done in November. And, I don't know when you play that game, right? That's the problem.
Yeah.
But
whatever. Semantics.
Yeah, no, and I mean, there's so many different avenues you can kind of go down in that ownership group there. And, one of the things that we were just mentioning there with the Elks ownership group was obviously Chris Jones was ultimately relieved of his duties and was unemployed for all of 48 hours until, he has now received his
flight to Hamilton.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, with Chris Jones kind of moving over to there, Kyle and I were even discussing on a recent episode, here's a guy who obviously cut his teeth as kind of that defensive guru. And, that went up in flames in short order when he went out west. And, his record out there speaks for itself. But was it just a case of he was wearing too many hats and, he couldn't keep the lid on everything when he's being GM, head coach, and trying to do all of this? And now him getting back to the basics of, all right, I'm a defensive coordinator now. We're going to kind of see what ultimately that lore of Chris Jones kind of got built up on? Or do you think this is maybe potentially even his last kick at the can? Because if he can't get back to the basics of what made him such a sought after commodity, we might be seeing him out of the league in short order.
Well, I'll give you an interesting fact about Chris Jones. When he was fired in Edmonton, that's the first time he'd ever been fired in his CFL career. He'd never been fired or even part of a staff that got fired, just where you get swept out, in the whole thing that. So it was a pretty remarkable distinction for a guy who I think in the league since about 2001. No, and to your point, talking to people who played for Chris in Edmonton, that is what they tell me, right? That he's really good at that. And by being head coach, GM, personnel guy, defensive coordinator, he became, good at
diluted essentially.
Yeah. He did it all, but he wasn't doing anything at a superb level. And it took away what he was really, really good at. And, they kind of got into that by necessity. Remember, they fired their coach and general manager, Brock Sunderland and Jamie Elizondo, each with 2 years remaining on their deals, bottomed themselves out on the salary operate coach's cap, had to find somebody who could do 3 jobs. And ultimately, that's, I think, why Chris got the job, because not many guys have a resume. You could even theoretically say, could you do these 3 jobs? Well, Chris actually could, or at least, felt like he could, but he couldn't do them at the level that was necessary to be successful. So, yeah, look, I think there's always going to be, I don't think Chris is one stop away, because I don't think you're going to see somebody do what they did in Saskatchewan, 6-7 years ago, where they basically handed them the keys, right? And say, here, it's your show. And I by the way, I don't think that's ever a good idea. When you see, whether it's the CFL or the NFL, look at the number of times somebody has found their savior, kind of handed them the keys to the kingdom and said, aha, we found the guy who's going to, remember Chip Kelly in Philadelphia? How'd that go? It's not.
I'm trying to still erase those years from my memory as an Eagles fan. So.
It's not the way it works. So, they did that they did that by choice in Saskatchewan. They did it by necessity in Edmonton. But I would think that Chris Jones is probably going to be coaching in this league for a long time. And he may not be a head coach again for a very long time. I mean, he may not be a head coach practice. He may not be a head coach, ever again in the league. But I think if you look at guys who are defensive specialists, and I'll give you an example, Rich Stubler, right? Rich Stubler was always employed, and he had one head coaching career and he went 4-6, and he got fired. 4-6. Anyway, but Rich Stubler was always on somebody's staff because he knew defense. You brought in Rich Stubler, you had no illusions about what he was there for, right? He was going to be there to coach your defense, and he was going to coach a certain style of defense that we all know what it was, right? It was the force them to make 14 plays down the field, keep everything in front of you, wrap and tackle. Orlando Steinauer was like the classic safety in his system. But I think Chris Jones could fall into that kind of mold where, there will always be a place for him in the Canadian Football League. And look, and I'm going to say, I like having Chris Jones in the league for two reasons. Okay. One, he evokes a lot of emotion in fans. There's people that love him and people that hate him. We can't have a league of Rick Campbells, right? And Rick's a really good coach, but nobody hates him. Nobody hates Rick Campbell. Who the fans hate that are going to evoke emotion, right? So I love that. He's a character, right? When Chris Jones is wearing black on the sidelines, I hate that guy. That's good. And the other thing is, Chris Jones is one of the most creative people I've ever met in football, just in terms of looking at things. Obviously, not all his ideas work, but he is a guy who's willing to reinvent the wheel. And I'll tell you a little story. I did an interview with Chris. Remember that season he came in and he was defensive coordinator and, like I said, hired gun, right? They brought him to Toronto. In fact, it was Stubler that they brought him in to work with. And, it was like, first the Argos like, he's not really taking over. He's going to work with Stubs. And then at the end of the first practice, I said, Chris, are you in charge of defense? Yeah, I'm in charge. It's like, no, cool. Right? First day. So we were doing a story on when CFL playoffs come around, we have to kind of prep a number of features because we don't know who's going to win and who's going to lose, right? So some of them, the features that you see air on Grey Cup Sunday, there's other features that never made it to Grey Cup Sunday because their teams didn't make it. And we were planning one on AC Leonard. And Chris was the guy who converted AC Leonard from, I believe he was a tight end in college, to obviously a defensive end in the CFL. And so I went down and interviewed Chris at a hotel suite in downtown Toronto about that story. And when we turned off the cameras, like we did probably 20-minute interview about AC Leonard, him and me and the producer sat there, must have been 2 hours, just spitballing, just listening to him, just bringing. I felt like I could sit there and listen to him all night. I mean, I never played the game. I never played it down. I never coached. I never did anything. Everything I know about football, I've got from listening to people and asking questions and absorbing what they've done. So I love to do that. And Chris is one of the greatest at that. Like, you can sit there and listen to him all night, and he's very entertaining. So I really do hope there's always a place for Chris Jones in the Canadian Football League.
Yeah, and I think there's very few and far between people like that you can genuinely sit in a room with and not get tired of listening to. No. And yeah, like anytime you can get a personality like that, for sure. I mean, it's great for you guys on the journalistic side because they're always good for a quote and they're always teaching you something that you can take into the next interview that you do, right?
Absolutely.
And then from a player's perspective, I mean, anytime you're learning, you're always getting better, right? And when you can genuinely sit there and, because like, listen, I played for Wally Bond. It was only for a year, but just listening to him, his aura that he had around him, it made everyone who played for him into a different type of person, which was great. So that's phenomenal. I mean, we're talking about auras. You mentioned the Argos, and this was kind of something that I had looked up. So obviously you've been doing this a long time, but once upon a time you were cutting your teeth as a young journalist in Toronto.
Yes.
And you had the great fortune of being able to cover one of the best CFL teams in history, which is the 1991 Toronto Argonauts.
My first year
which was owned by John Candy, Bruce McDonald, Wayne Gretzky. And they did something unprecedented, that they brought up a player who was arguably the number one overall prospect in college football up to the CFL, and Rocket Ismail. Now, the reason I bring that up is because that's when I first started watching the CFL, and that's what made me fall in love with the game, was watching Rocket Ismail play in the CFL. Take us through that and kind of how amazing that was in the atmosphere in Toronto back then.
I mean, I'll even go back to when they signed, right? Because, I mean, Rocket Ismail, he was a receiver kick returner at Notre Dame when Notre Dame was really, really good. I mean, he was on the cover of Sports Illustrated the year before, like with a helmet, and I think there was a dollar sign on the helmet. The headline was "Pro Football's Next Superstar." Like, that was when Sports Illustrated magazine was a thing, right? Like, you're on the cover of SI and they're declaring you pro football's next superstar. I think there was a pretty good chance he was going to be the number one pick of the draft. It actually was Russell Maryland who went. Yep. So, like, there wasn't another guy that was like, oh, you know, you got to have, you know, there wasn't a Caleb Williams that year, put it that way.
Right.
And I remember seeing the news conference, you know, and blue and white balloons, John Candy, Bruce McNall, and holy smokes, right? And they paid him $4.5 million a year, I think, US at that time. Jerry Rice was making $1 million. Like, he was making, if you divide that money, let me see, 18 game schedule into $4.5 million, what do you get? Like, what are we talking? Like $400,000 a year, a game?
Yeah.
400 game in 1991. Like, it's and you know what I think what it was modeled on was the Gretzky thing, right? Because McNall had brought Gretzky to LA and Shazam, and he looked at this big market that had once loved the Argonauts, and at that time, not that long ago, right? Like, this is 1991. In '83, they nearly burned the city down when they won the Grey Cup. So, you know, it was like, we can and we got all these empty seats, and do the math on if we can sell all the I talked to Rocket. Rocket actually came through Toronto about 4 or 5 years ago, and he came to the radio station when I was at TSN Toronto, and we talked to him a little bit and just off air, and he talked about it sort of being long term, that he thought it was an NFL play, you know, that was ultimately what this was about, because it was hard to see. I mean, I thought at the time it was a U.S. expansion play, right? Because that was what in fact, if you look in June of 1992, the CFL played an exhibition game in Portland, Oregon. And it was the Argos and the Stampeders. And that's because they wanted people to see Rocket Ismail, and they wanted people to see Doug Flutie, right? And that was kind of the whole idea, that I think that they had these two superstar recognizable names from the U.S. But Rocket, I'll tell you where Rocket was. He was the right guy as a player. He was not the right guy off the field. And I'm not saying he was a bad guy, but
yeah,
paying you that much money, you need to be willing to do everything that they want you to do. You do, whether, you know, the media, the public relations stuff, like, that's what that was about. And he didn't want to do that. He just wanted to play football, you know? When I dealt with him, again, I was a very young reporter. I was 23 years old that summer. And I had really no experience, so I didn't have much to compare it to, but he wasn't, I would say he was difficult to deal with, but I remember that he wasn't easy. I remember once being in his locker, and I was actually Pinball who said to him, when I was standing right there, said, "What are you doing this evening?" or something. And he said, so loud enough that I could hear it, "Getting out of here as quickly as possible." You know, right? So, and again, I don't think he was a bad guy, but I just think he was the wrong guy. If you're going to invest that kind of money and make that kind of play, you need to know that this guy is all in on more than just playing football. And, you know, I ultimately only spent 2 years in Toronto. But it was an exciting team. I mean, that was when the celebrities were coming in, the plane loads of people from Hollywood, and Mariel Hemingway and Jim Belushi. And I mean, it was, and then, you know, after the game, they were in restaurants in Toronto, all these like Hollywood stars. It was a remarkable time. And, you know, John Candy loved the Argos. You know, I mean, the things he did, John Candy would fly into the city where the Argonauts were playing. Like, let's say they're playing in Saskatchewan, and they're landing, if the game's on Friday and the Argos are going to land there on Thursday, John Candy would go out on Wednesday and like do media to stir up interest for the game in other cities. Yeah. And at that time, one of the biggest comedic actors in Hollywood. It was, boy, this league has seen some times, man.
Yeah, and you know what? The reason why I bring that up is when I saw that, I said, you know what? It was so nostalgic for me, because again, that's what got me interested in the league, in the CFL. Sure. John Candy was my favorite actor when I was young, sure, right? Watching The Great Outdoors and Uncle Buck, yep, and, you know, those types of movies, and seeing kind of all that collaborate to being what it was, which was a spectacle. Like you're mentioning, it's a spectacle every single week. Yeah. And the fact that you're seeing that, I mean, there's a great documentary on John Candy's tenure as the owner of the Argonauts called True Double Blue, I believe. Yeah. And it's phenomenal. It kind of brings everything together and just shows you what an owner should be like in professional sports. Because I think that if he had sole ownership of it, it would have been completely different. Because obviously McNall everything came back to, well, he was embezzling money from here and taking money from there, and everything kind of fell through. But yeah, 100%. That was such a great time, and it must have been so thrilling for you to go through it at that time. And looking back at it, just being, wow, like this is amazing that I was able to kind of start out with that, and everything's just kind of been a roller coaster since then.
It was my first basically gig. I was actually an intern at the Globe and Mail, and the nice thing about being an intern was they didn't baby you at the Globe and Mail. It was like you were there to work, and they had made some cuts to their sports department, and I ended up covering the Argos that year. And I was at Chris Schultz's funeral, which I guess is 3-4 years ago now, and there were so many guys from that team that were back there, or who were mentioned as it kind of really brought me back to that 91 team. And it's funny, because of course I work with Matt Dunnigan. I was sitting next to him on the panel on Sunday night, and I'm sure you guys understand what I'm saying is when you work with people in a different context, this is going to sound really weird, but you forget they are. Like I sometimes forget that Matt Dunnigan is Matt Dunnigan. He's Matt, my colleague on TV, right? Or same thing with Stiegel or any of those guys that I covered them all. David Sanchez and I, hang out sometimes, and I covered him, but I don't think of him as the guy that I covered all those years, if you know what I mean. I kind of have to remind myself. And yeah, like Matt Dunnigan, like I think, I'm not saying this because I work with him, I think Matt Dunnigan, in the context of history, is one of the most underrated Canadian Football League quarterbacks. When we did that top 50 list, probably 15 years ago at TSN, and it was exhaustive. The research that went into that was unreal, because they wanted it to be authentic. And I can't remember where Matt was on that list, but I remember going up to him and saying, by the way, you should be a lot higher on that list. The biggest knock on Matt was he had a lot of injuries, right? That he missed a lot of time. But boy, if you needed to win one game, and he was, that was part of that story of that Argonaut team was he came back in that Grey Cup, and like I don't know how many quarterbacks could have played with what he was dealing with going into that game. It was, and got through it and won it, and then left by a free agency. The whole thing was after that year they didn't want to pay him. They wanted to put him on kind of a pay for play contract, right, because of his injury history. And he went to Winnipeg, and the whole thing, I think Adam Rita got fired the next year. So it all dissipated. Like that was one spectacular Argonaut year. Paul Woods in his book, Year of the Rocket, documented all of it beautifully, but it didn't last long. It was like candy, right? It wasn't sustainable. It was like candy. This tastes really good, but I can't eat this every day, right? That's what the 91 Argos were all about.
Yeah.
Well, we're talking Argos, we're talking quarterbacks. We might as well make the full news cycle here, which is Chad Kelly, obviously coming back to Toronto here. And Kyle and I have already covered the kind of off-field aspect of it on several episodes on this here. But just in terms of his impact, because this is a team who both of us had said, if they can tread water at around 500 by the time Kelly is ready to come back, they're in a pretty good position to come out of the East and go on a deep run here. So what kind of an impact do you think him coming back and suiting up and being under center is going to have on this team? And can they, barring maybe Montreal is a little bit too far gone at this point to catch them, but Ottawa's definitely in their sights. Can they leapfrog them? Like, are they the presumptive favorites, or does the path still lead through Montreal as the defending Grey Cup champions in your mind?
Well, I think it still goes through Montreal because they've lost one game since September 15th last year, right? It's, they're 9-1 this year, but you tack that on with whatever they finished with their Grey Cup run in the end of the regular season. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but they got to be about like 15, 16-1. So,
yeah.
And they, everybody thought they were a good team that could play defense and run the ball. And all of a sudden, Cody Fajardo reinvents himself this year. And then the guy who's their number 3, looks as good as he did. So, they've got the depth at quarterback. Their two best receivers are both Canadians, which, when that's your luxury, when the two best guys you have are Canadians and you can stack Americans around them. And now they've got Austin Mack back.
Austin Mack, yeah.
This is, and I think they were able to build so much depth because they won the Grey Cup ahead of schedule, right? Usually when you win a Grey Cup, you lose so many guys on your team through free agency. It's the nature of the league. But that wasn't supposed to happen last year. So they, when they're building, they're adding players while retaining the guys they had that helped them win the Grey Cup. So they're deep. They've got quarterback talent. Their defense is superb. They're really, really tough. But back to your question. Look, I think all the dynamics around Chad Kelly make it very, very hard to handicap how this is going to go, just because it's such an unusual situation. But if we assume that he's just going to be able to play football and not be distracted, and teammates are going to accept him and all those kinds of things, I mean, I think it's a huge opportunity, because the Argos, to your point, have treaded water. And how have they done it? Defense and special teams, right? You give me a touchdown on defense and a touchdown on special teams every week, like they've been getting sometimes. I don't care who's playing quarterback. We're going to win a lot of games. So it's not like there's not room for improvement at the quarterback position. There is, and you're not going to get the defense and special teams performing at the level they have thus far. But I think you've got strength on both those sides of the ball. And now you're going to basically, Chad Kelly is coming in, and not only is he returning as an elite quarterback, but he's addressing the greatest area of need for this team, because they basically haven't had a vertical passing game all year, right? That's been it. And just watching him at practice today, bombing it. Now, that's, not what he's going to do. I don't know if he'll come out. I would suggest he probably shouldn't try to do that Thursday night, right? Play within himself a little bit, at least to begin. And it's a tough matchup, because Corey Mace would certainly know him, as the head coach and defensive coordinator on the other side of the ball. And then he goes to Hamilton on Labor Day. So the schedule is pretty interesting. But I just think that because the Argos have received such, let's call it mediocre play at quarterback, there's just so much room for improvement at the game's most important position. And they're, by no means out of it. So, yeah, I think the table is quite set for Toronto to kind of take a run here in the second half.
Yeah. And again, there's so much of a logjam in the middle. You really don't know who's going to come out of it, not only hosting a game, but doing the crossover, which is obviously a huge issue when it comes to Canadian Football League playoffs. Historically, we see the team that has to go the crossover playing the away game, not necessarily going to be in the best scenario to win that game. So if Toronto can really, put a few wins together and come out either first or second, because obviously Montreal's got a good beat on that first overall spot. It's really Ottawa who's in their way now of being that second, spot in the East. So if they can, maybe address, the internal issues that you've alluded to and put a run together, now you're in a position where, hey, we can at least host one game, and then we come back and, anything can happen in the conference championships.
Well, and people sometimes make light of the CFL playoffs. 6 out of 9 teams make it. But to me, the big difference between that and, say, hockey or the NBA or something is that the difference between finishing first, second, or third in the CFL is massive.
It is.
I mean, you finished first, you got to win one home game, you're in the Grey Cup. You finish second, you host a playoff game. You finish third, you got to win twice on the road against teams that have better record than you. So it's not like those other sports where basically there's not much difference between, being first and being eighth, other than seeding. But it's not like you're getting a bye, or you don't have to go on the road, or, you know what I mean? It's just, I think there's a lot of gravity to where you finish in the standings in the Canadian Football League, which I think kind of mitigates some of the, 6 out of 9 making the playoffs.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, Dave, we appreciate the time that you took to sit down with us tonight. And, for those that are listening, I know most of them know where to find you these days, but in terms of social media or anything else you want to plug there, where can people tune in and check out all the great content you're plugging out these days?
I am a Twitter or X guy. So yeah, at TSN, Dave Naylor is, you can find all my content there and thoughts on 99% of it is football. Occasionally I share a thought about it, but it's all football all the time at TSN, Dave Naylor.
Hey, round of applause. Golf clap for Mr. Dave Naylor stopping by, talking all things CFL with us there.
What a phenomenal interview that was. That was so much fun for me. You have no idea.
Well, anytime you get to talk about the John Candy era Argonauts there, smile on your face.
Dude, I can talk about the 1991 Toronto Argonauts for days, and I've got time for anyone who wants to talk about it as well. So, again, happy that Dave was a part of that. And yeah, I mean, even those Ottawa stories, I mean, you think about everything that's happened with Ottawa football in the last 25 years. like insane.
Lieberman and a little bit of a shiver goes down your spine.
The funny part is that he's talking about that. I was at that Grey Cup because I was playing for the University of Ottawa at the time. At that Grey Cup, it was going around in the stands that the Liebermans were actually going to be buying the team. And then I remember that in that press conference where they had the new coaching staff come in, and we were all there because we had just finished practices. That's where we played. Was at Frank Clair. And seeing the clown car of coaches that they rolled out in front of the media, we were like, yeah, this team's done. Like, there's no chance that they're going to be finishing up here.
Stick a fork in them.
Yeah. The good thing was, though, there's one positive out of that whole scenario with Ottawa folding was that we got to take over their locker room, which we'd never been able to do prior to that. So we felt like kings of the world because we're dressing in like a CFL locker room now. We've got like all the amenities that you can ask for, and it was great. So again, thanks for folding, guys, because it really made our 2006 championship season, A1.
Well, part of me takes a little bit of joy in just seeing you pendulum swing from the highest of highs to
I know
you're getting a stern dad looks coming out.
You almost had me going before we even logged in, but you told me to save it for this, so I've saved up my venom for this particular segment.
Yeah. So for those who have been living under a rock, speaking of St. Louis,
stay there. Stay under your rock.
Naylor was suggesting the CFL ad. They've been a little bit frisky with some of your favorite players who, Mr. Holloway, you're just talking him up, 3 episodes ago? And
yeah.
No, hope you didn't order that extra large jersey of his.
Yeah. I mean, do you want me to just talk about Holloway, or do you want to dive into the full scale St. Louis Blues just pulling a douchebag move on Edmonton?
I kind of want to just cede my time and let you rant. So the floor is yours, big guy.
All right. So those of you who aren't aware, the St. Louis Blues pulled a rat move of offer sheeting Dylan Holloway and Philip Broberg of the Edmonton Oilers, fresh off of a Stanley Cup run, both of which are 23 years old, look to be trending in the right direction, former first round picks, and yeah, basically St. Louis looked at Edmonton's financial situation and said, you know what, we're gonna just throw a monkey wrench in that whole scenario. And yeah, they basically offered both gentlemen contracts well above their estimated salary totals for this coming season and the year after.
However, $1 underneath the values that would have pushed the compensation to the next level as well.
But again, like, is that where we're at in hockey right now, where you pay a defenseman $4.5 million who, obviously is going to be a top 4 defenseman, and all it nets you is a second-round pick in return? Like, is that where we're at right now?
I don't know. Is this a referendum on Gary Bettman's CBA or?
I don't know. Anyways, long story short, Edmonton decided not to match after making a slew of moves that would have everyone thinking the contrary, with trading away Cody Ceci, with potentially putting Evander Kane on long-term injured reserve because he needs hernia surgery and a hip replacement. So one would think, probably not going to be able to start the season. But in his infinite wisdom, our new GM, Stan Bowman, decided to, you know what, I'm just going to make these trades for the sake of making them. And then at the last second, I'm going to say, nope, I don't want to make those moves and match those contracts because it's a business decision. And that's all I'll say on the matter. So congratulations, Stan Bowman. I will give you a very stern dad glance because you've been on the job, a month? And you obviously had one of the worst press conferences in the history of the Edmonton Oilers. You've then proceeded to do nothing other than pretty much draw a lot of vitriol from the NHL community that you're back on the scene. Now you've taken an opportunity to bring back 2 23-year-olds on 2-year contracts, so it's not going to affect anything long-term, all for the sake of making a business decision. Because these are moves that you want to make, and these aren't guys that you drafted. So you deem that 2 former first-round picks who are just entering their prime are only worth a second and a third-round pick. So very stern dad glance over to you, Mr. Bowman, and a very stern dad glance over to you, Mr. Armstrong with St. Louis, for being the rat that you are.
Well, again, with absolutely no horse in the race here. I simply ask the questions that you can then respond to. Do you think this move happens if Doug Armstrong, who is noted golfing buddies with Mr. Ken Holland, is still GM?
I mean, he says not, but there's no way that he's making this move if Ken Holland is still the GM. This is a welcome back to the league idiot, just Stan Bowman, and basically putting him on the seat. And again, looking at the full scope, if I'm a St. Louis fan, it's a great move. Because like, what's the harm in losing a second and third round pick for two potential, top six and top four? Right? Yeah, like, for two first rounders.
The math checks out.
The math checks out. Their assets haven't depreciated that much. So, I mean, as an Edmonton fan, I hate the guy, but as an overall hockey fan, very smart and business move, especially because you're sticking it to a guy who's now genuinely, looked at as being a villain in the NHL. So, I mean, I see it from one end, but I hate it because I unfortunately cheer for the team who was on the other end of
it. If I was a fan of 31 other NHL teams, I would love this move.
Yeah, I'd be applauding it. Honestly, I'd be like, well done, Mr. Armstrong. But I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan.
Well, there we go. We took you from the highest of highs to the lowest of lows there, but good job by you for containing your rage, knowing that this needed to get vented out at the end of the episode for the entirety of the Dave Naylor interview. So, golf clap to Kyle Kirkwood for sitting on that one there.
And until next week, we will get another thing that Kyle wants to rile me up about.